Washington, D.C., I've got a fantasy. Oh, that I escape the me. The me I always thought I'd be. You escape the you. Scared to be a nobody. Oh, Washington.
All right, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Some say it's one of the world's most famous addresses. Here we are, standing in front of the White House. Welcome to Washington, D.C. My name is Megan. Let's get a closer look. Here we have the White House, home of the executive branch of the United States government. In the past, this has been known as the People's Palace, the Presidential Palace, or the People's House. It really wasn't until Teddy Roosevelt that the name White House really came to be the primary name for the president's residence. Looking at it, you may see in comparison to me, I'm actually pretty close to the White House. It's not the largest building, certainly not as large as the Capitol. Even it's not quite as large as some mansions here in the United States, definitely not as large as palaces that you might see in Europe. And there's a reason for that. The idea is that the president is supposed to be first among equals. And so the House is supposed to be a place for him to work, place for them to live, but it's not supposed to inspire that level of grandeur and omnipotence, the descendant of the gods that you get with palaces. And the idea is that they come, they live, but then they also leave. This is a place that belongs to the American public. Actually, to that point, when Abraham Lincoln was president, people were known to literally walk up the driveway, walk into the White House, put down their calling card and be like, I'm here to see the president. I just came from Iowa. I just came from Indiana. Basically, they would just come in, walk off the street, and be like, I want to come talk to the president, and just walk straight into the White House. Eventually, fences were erected, and so nowadays, we do stand just outside. The White House itself, we are on the north side. The way that the White House and the Capitol were both designed throws back to French architecture, the idea that you don't have a backyard that people don't see. The entire building is meant to be looked at. So we are on the north side, what is known as the street side. The back side is where you see the famous trim-in balcony with the rose gardens and such. So that would be the garden side. It's a little harder to get quite as close in because that is the president's yard. And so we are going to stand over here. Now, the White House itself went through a bit of growing pains right after, or not right after, but very soon after its construction. The War of 1812 happened, and the British came in to Washington, D.C., and they burned the place. And we actually had to abandon the Capitol for a while. Dolly Madison was the first lady. She had been planning to entertain, and the feast was actually left abandoned in the White House as she grabbed a portrait of George Washington and fled. The British soldiers ate the dinner that she had made for her guests and then burned the place to the ground. Washington actually would have suffered a lot more damage, though, except a freak typhoon, effectively, came in and just drenched the city and actually put out a lot of the fires that the British had set. Otherwise, there would have been even more excessive amounts of damage to the city of Washington, D.C. The White House was rebuilt in our lovely classical style, and as I mentioned before, has become one of the most iconic addresses, especially here in the United States. All right, here behind me is a cream-colored building with a green awning. This is what's known as Blair House. Blair House is the official guest house of the president. This is also the house where the president-elect stays before their inauguration. The Blair House came to be during World War II. Now, during World War II, we had a couple close allies, but in particular, FDR and Winston Churchill worked very, very closely together. And Winston Churchill would come and visit the United States, stay in Washington, D.C. Now, up until that time, most of the time, the personal guests of the president stayed in the White House. However, Winston Churchill had a couple interesting habits. He tended to stay up very, very late at night. He tended to be drinking whiskey. He tended to be smoking a cigar, and he tended to not be wearing his bathrobe closed very much. And this tended to bother Mrs. Roosevelt. So Eleanor Roosevelt basically insisted to her husband that they find another place for Winston Churchill to stay because she was tired of the cigar smoke, she was tired of him wandering the halls at night, and she was tired of him not putting on appropriate clothing. And so they found a place basically across the street from the White House, so that way then they would be Winston Churchill would be close by and they would be able to work together easily, but was just far enough removed that Mrs. Roosevelt was no longer being forced into uncomfortable environments.
Washington, D.C., hold out your arms to me. Oh, remind me that I'm home, home. Remind me you belong to me. Oh, Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C., I've got a fantasy. Oh, that I escape the me. Always thought I'd be. You escaped the you. Scared to be a nobody. Oh, Washington, D.C. Take off your hat and tie. Step out of the public. Come home, yeah, you're home to me. Washington, D.C., Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C., you've had enough of me. Oh, you took me to the train, and watched it roll away with me. I trace you on the window pane. You say goodbye so stoically. Oh, Washington, D.C. We've been trying hard not to talk about the lonely road we'll walk about. What's a girl to do but spend a lot of time away? What's a girl to do but spend a lot of time away?